Diane Coyle és una de les veus més lúcides, influents i transformadores de l'economia actual. Va ser pionera als anys 90 a l'hora d'estudiar i repensar el progrés en l'era digital i ha mantingut una visió crítica i pragmàtica sobre l'economia al llarg de la seva trajectòria. Coyle ens planteja una pregunta clau. Quan diem que l'economia va bé, què vol dir realment i qui se n'està beneficiant? Val molt la pena escoltar la resposta a aquesta i altres qüestions de la professora Dame Diane Coyle. Good morning, Professor Dame Diane Coyle. It's absolutely wonderful to have you with us today. The Open University of Catalonia, the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, and the Faculty of Economics and Business are absolutely delighted that you received the accolade of honorary doctorate from our university.
Thank you for the invitation and for the honour. I'm just so delighted to be here.
I'd like to begin with an idea that runs through so much of your work. What we choose to measure really fundamentally shapes what we're able to see and hence what we're able to understand in the long term. When we talk about economic progress, are we perhaps giving too much authority to measures that are much narrower than we admit? And what are the questions that we should be asking instead, perhaps?
The question of what should be measuring does run through lots of my work, because if you're interested in doing anything to make things better, as I am as a public policy scholar and economist, you have to ask, what does better mean? It's better for whom, and how are you going to measure how things are progressing? Now, of course, for more than 70 years now, economies have been looking towards GDP as their measure of progress, gross domestic product, which is a measure, roughly speaking, of all of the paid for activities in the economy plus what the government does as well. So it's a monetary measure, and it obviously omits lots of things that we would care about and think were valuable. One obvious one is unpaid care in the home, work in the home. So the care economy is, in a sense, invisible to policymakers. Another example would be all of the natural resources that we have been using for free, and the bill for that free use over more than half a century is coming due in different ways, and loss of biodiversity, climate change, and so on. So the fact that we've had a very narrow monetary paid-for economy metric has actually distorted the kinds of actions that policymakers and businesses take, because that increase in GDP has been the target. This is well understood, and so for the past almost 20 years, there's been a movement labelled Beyond GDP, which has looked at alternative kinds of measures. Some people would directly measure happiness, which I find to be problematic in different ways, and we can talk about that if you would like to. Mm-hmm. Some people like to have a dashboard, which can include all kinds of different things that are really hard to compare to each other. But then that's a little bit ad hoc, and you get many, many indicators that you want to look at. The Sustainable Development Goals, for example, have over 300 indicators included in them. How do you evaluate that as a policymaker? So what I try to do is to find a small number of measures that would help policymakers, decision makers, steer the economy in a practical way, and also in a way that would command enough consensus among statisticians and economists that we will all do the same thing and we can benchmark the kind of progress that we're making. The approach is called comprehensive wealth. It's the sort of balance sheet for the economy. Just as any business has a balance sheet as well as a profit and loss, we should have a balance sheet for the economy as well as GDP growth. That will help us understand sustainability or not. And it will be a limited number of metrics that you can keep an eye on. So the analogy is often your car dashboard. You're mainly looking at the speedometer, but you want to check the oil gauge and the pressure and so on from time to time as well. So that's the aim. It's theoretically grounded. It's a limited number of metrics. It can command consensus, and importantly, it brings in sustainability, both environmental and social, in ways that looking at GDP alone has ignored for so many decades now.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of comprehensive wealth, I think, is very interesting in the context you're describing. So what would you say are the consequences of trying to govern a 21st century economy through statistical categories that we inherited from an earlier industrial era? Do you think there's a danger of what's not properly measured becomes politically invisible?
Well, I think that is a danger. And so having talked about things like care work or the environment, The other part of the economy that we are not seeing well at the moment because of the framework that we've inherited from the industrial economy of the post-war era is the whole digital phenomenon. If you think about the way that our lives have changed since the iPhone arrived in 2007, that combination of mobile devices, the communications technologies, 3G and beyond, the app designs that have made all of this possible. So as consumers, but also in terms of business models, there's been a huge transformation in the economy in the past 20 years. That's largely invisible in the official statistics. It's partly because a lot of that activity happens overseas. Big American companies record a lot of it. There's no reason they share that with statistical agencies in other economies. But the structure of the categories we look at, the occupations, the industrial categories that we look at, doesn't make it easy to track what's going on through digital innovation and new kinds of business models. And so I think that's an imperative alongside thinking about all the other things that we talked about earlier to understand this structural change in the economy, because digital AI and also renewable energy, these are big structural changes. They're what economists would call general purpose technologies. And so what happens now, decisions made now, policies adopted now, will shape our economic futures for decades to come. And so not having a very clear view of how much data is being generated, who, quotes, owns that data, or at least can monetize that data, who is gaining the benefits of these innovations, are really very political, as you suggest, and a fundamental gap in knowledge about the economy.
And on this idea of intangible value, which challenges the way economics can understand and make sense of productivity, make sense of competition, growth, labor, etc. You've been one of the leading voices globally in explaining how much value is in present economies is now intangible. The idea that data has been referred to as the new petroleum, for example. The value that is generated from software, from design industries, reproductive and informal labor, intellectual property, attention, happiness, as you mentioned earlier. How can economists rethink some of these challenges in relation to issues such as productivity, competition, growth, etc.?
A lot of the value created now is intangible. It's the design, it's the information. Information is always what's made economies run, but that is now the majority of the value that's being created in our economies. If you look at every additional pound or euro of GDP, that for 2-3 decades now the increment has been in the intangible value. We're using more stuff, of course, as the economies grow, but all of that relative increase is intangible. One that I've been thinking a lot about recently is data, because data fuels AI. I think that's where the oil analogy comes from, and it's going to be very powerful. So understanding how do things get classified, and how does that data then feed into the services that are being produced and that we're using? How does that shape decisions? How does that shape social outcomes? Is a fundamentally important question for me. And particularly as this is not just about the private sector making decisions, it's about governments using AI increasingly to make decisions as well that have a really high impact on people's lives. So for welfare or housing allocation and so on, employers are using it. So this is a really socially powerful technology, as well as one that's driving economic growth. And yet it's just an unknown, it's an open question about how do you think as a national government or a regional government about what data should there be available about your economy? Who should be able to access that? What are the trade-offs involved? So, for example, to make competition work better in digital markets, you might want to insist as a regulator that companies share some of their data that they're collecting from individuals. We have an example in the UK that's open banking, where an individual can give permission for their financial data to be shared with a new entrant into the market. So it's meant to break up the oligopoly of the big banks and allow new fintech startups, which has been quite successful. But there are trade-offs, because you are reducing the commercial value of that data for the original owners, so it has to be proportionate. And there are privacy concerns as well. And so that's the kind of calculus about data that we need now, and that's not available. So it's one of the pieces of research I would like to do in the near future is to think about what does a healthy data economy look like, and what are the implications to get from where we are now to the policy framework that would enable that to come about.
Okay, yeah, the idea of the healthy data economy, extremely important. You've had a really incredible career to date. You've moved between the worlds of academic research, public policy, journalism, and institutional leadership, and really you've been at the forefront of public-facing debate in many senses. How has this movement within your career influenced the way the kind of questions you ask as an economist?
Oh, that's a good question. So it's been accidental. I didn't plan to have this kind of career when I was leaving university. And each bit has enriched the others. I've learnt so much from each different category of experience. But I've ended up being an academic, and I think it's been really influential in shaping the kinds of questions I want to research. Because on the one hand, I'm very motivated by public service. I've done lots of public service roles in the past, and that continues to be an important personal driver for me. But it also helps inform, what are the questions? What are the societal questions? If you're a social scientist, I think you have to be fundamentally interested in that question we started with: what's making society better over time? And you learn that from engaging with people who are in business or making policy decisions in the fog of war that constitutes government these days, with the kind of media and tensions that we have. And just that understanding helps you frame questions better. It also gives you access to a really important source of advice, information, sometimes even data, which can be really useful for research. And so I think being outward facing in that way, it's very important for academics to do more of that than has been typical, I think.
And thinking about your influence within a new generation of economists and public policy scholars, what would you most want the new generation of scholars to hold on to as they begin their careers in the field of economics, public policy?
That's a challenging question. I mean, we want all kinds of economists as well. I've been more focused on who are the people coming into economics, because I think if you get the right people studying a subject, in a sense, it will then take care of itself. And like computer science or engineering, economics has long been very male-dominated. The proportion of women hasn't changed very much over time. It's socially quite narrow, and increasingly, as it becomes very technical and rests on mathematical skills, that excludes a lot of people as well. And so I would like us to become much more effective than we have been at broadening the intake. And there are some very good schemes doing that in the UK. There's a scheme that goes into schools and tries to encourage people at 16 to think economics is an interesting subject. The Government Economic Service has introduced apprenticeships, which has a very different kind of intake than university graduates. So if you get that right, I think you get a much wider range of questions. But there's lots of institutional reform needed in the discipline beyond that as well. And it's an uphill struggle because people don't like changing what they do.
And what's your take on inter and multidisciplinarity in this context?
Oh, well,
how important
it's essential. And that's one of the things I love about UOC. It's that the problems that society faces are not single discipline problems. And in my area, looking at the digital economy, it's just very hard to see how I would do that without talking a lot with computer science colleagues.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, and I'd like to wrap up our talk today. For a university like the UOC, like the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, as we are rooted in knowledge and innovation and digital society, what would you say are the questions we should be asking ourselves when we think about economic innovation and progress?
If you're talking about innovation, the key question for me is innovation for whom? Who is it going to benefit? When you look back over the history of technology, ultimately, the new technologies always bring wider benefits to society, but there's a struggle to get there. And we saw it with printing, we saw it with broadcast and electrification. All of these big technologies are disruptive. And one of the questions I sometimes ask myself is, why is it that automation in the 1990s in manufacturing destroyed so many jobs, including in my family, because we come from a textile area in the UK, when in the 1950s and 60s, the wave of automation did not have that same effect. And that was the period when we saw a decreasing income inequality, good jobs created in manufacturing, good wages. It's the institutional framework that makes the difference. And so alongside the questions about innovation and how you encourage that, I would ask students to look also at who is doing the innovating and who is benefiting from the innovating.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Professor Dame Diane Coyle. It's been wonderful to talk to you this morning.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation.